Our next talk is from Misha Kaletsky, who is, as I said, a founding member of Iterate, and he's going to talk about multiplayer MCP client. And I'm very excited for the talk, Misha. Thanks for joining. I know you're joining us all the way from London, so thanks for staying up late. And the floor is yours.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Definitely feels late in London. It's only 5:30 p.m. but pitch black because our clocks changed at the wrong time. Anyway, so yeah, I'll move off this screen to avoid infinite mirror. Yeah, I want to preface this by this has been a bit of a scramble. I want to make sure that I want this to be a kind of practical demo if possible, because these kinds of things it's sort of easier to see it. So bear with me. I'm going to try and show you some somewhat experimental features that we've been working on. So first of all, Iterate broadly, like you said, is basically a bot, which is a hackable multiplayer AI agent. So really, where it says AI agents, we never really wanted to be one of those companies who says like you can have as many agents as you like. We want to keep it simple and say like Iterate is a bot, but you can make Iterate behave the way that you want. And like the key features of it are that it's an MCP client and it lives in Slack, which basically and it is controlled entirely by you through a GitHub repository that's written in TypeScript. And so I'll go through. So basically, because it lives in Slack, you can think of it like ChatGPT, and it can do everything ChatGPT can do, and or any of the other models. And so you can add MCP servers, of course, but I think there's this key feature, which is that it's multiplayer. So it knows it. You can teach it about who you are, who your team is, and then you can have multiple people talking to this bot. It connects the tools, of course, via MCP. That's why we're all here. Like I said, it's customizable via TypeScript, which I'll show you a bit later on. And then there's also, I think there's a ton of stuff that Haley mentioned that I definitely want to think about very hard. Right now we have some like key primitives here. So we lean pretty heavily on the kind of platforms that we're building around. We might expand beyond Slack soon, but things like human in the loop, we actually implemented pretty fast, because basically instead of calling a tool, the agent will send a message saying, do you want me to call this tool? And if you react with a thumbs up via Slack, it'll execute it. There are kind of additional layers you can add if you want to say, are you really sure you want to call this tool? But that's the basic idea. So things like human in the loop kind of fall out of the architecture of this bot. Why MCP is probably similar to the reason that people like MCP in general. But you can think of Iterate as an MCP client. So what we've actually found ourselves doing over the last few months since building our latest iteration of the MCP client is we've been removing a lot of tools that we had already. So we had these first-class linear, Notion, post-hoc tools, and we've just said, okay, we're going to replace that with information about the MCP servers that we want our client to connect to, as well as some prompts to say, like, this is the best way to use some of these tools. And we're always going to be curating those to make sure our bot is as effective as possible. But the idea is that you can connect to anything. And we found, like the other day, someone on the team just sort of tried out, it's called Get Dialer, which has an MCP server, so you can authenticate. Our bot knew nothing of this, but entirely via Slack on his mobile, he was able to kind of start a phone call to someone else on the team just by chatting through Slack. Obviously, there are better ways to make phone calls on a phone, but it was a kind of good proof of concept. Just quickly about the architecture of Iterate, it's very heavily dependent on Cloudflare's durable objects, and in fact, the Agents SDK, for anyone who's interested. And I should have mentioned as well, on the very first slide, I think I had github.com/iterate/iterate. So if anyone is kind of interested in diving deeper on the technical implementation of some of these things, everything we're doing is open source, and you can if you're really interested, you can see some of the scramble that we've had to get a couple of things working today. So the basic implementation is Cloudflare Workers, Durable Objects with the Agents SDK wrappers, and event sourcing. So we've kind of implemented an agent loop similar to what you get in Claude Code by basically modeling everything as an event, because somewhat unlike Claude Code, because this lives in Slack, you can easily just have a conversation, a threaded conversation that doesn't get a response for 6 hours or something. So basically, everything is modeled as an event. There's Slack webhook events, and there are agent events when it gets results from MCP tool calls, for example. Another thing that we found it useful to do that I think is somewhat outside of the norm in terms of MCP clients is we have a tool call for connecting an MCP server. So this is why Haley's talk is something I'm going to definitely be thinking about, because we put a lot of the onus of how to safely use MCP servers onto our users, and we're kind of always providing guidance and working closely with customers. But basically, if you say I want to connect to this MCP server and you provide a URL, or you say go search the web for a URL for this MCP server, which would be a little on the riskier side, we have a tool to connect to that MCP server. We right now we don't have .mcp.json like some of the existing MCP client implementations. You basically just say, because what we really want to be able to do is just drive everything through Slack with some configuration in GitHub. So under the hood, this is kind of how it looks in our code. This is obviously a little simplified. And our system handles OAuth, so you'll see like a connect a linear button. It'll open up a browser window. I may be able to show you some of that later, but we'll get to it. So this dynamic tool loading, under the hood, we're firing an MCP connect request event. We see the OAuth flow, the user authorizes, and then once the connection is established, the tools are discovered and they are automatically injected into the agent context again. So this is kind of something that you definitely want to be aware of it working that way when you're using this for work in terms of security. But it can lead to a really smooth experience. And then in our server, we basically map these tools into the OpenAI callable function format and turn them into regular tools that our agent loop is then able to call. And I can show you a kind of a detailed example of basically the event log and how that looks in our backend system. But the upshot is the agent now has access to this tool. So this is standard MCP server stuff. Another distinction that is somewhat unique to us is the difference between a personal MCP server and a company MCP server. So because this is a multiplayer agent, most of our customers, who tend to be startups and founders with anywhere between 2 and 10 people, they'll have multiple people there. And I can show an example of this. A linear, just as like an issue management software, my linear view is going to be different from my teammate's linear view. And if I say something simple like list my linear issues, the bot needs to be smart enough to say, let's call this tool from the linear MCP server on behalf of me rather than on behalf of my teammate. And again, I can show you an example there. And then there are certain MCP servers that either don't support this or there's no great advantage to just dividing it up by user. So in our case, we use Posthog for our analytics, and they have an MCP server, but it just requires an API key. So we have a way of providing that API key so that the MCP server can authorize, but you're basically just saying like, what errors did we see today? But that's in what we call company mode. So we have to have a system where we map from a user to what's called a kind of MCP connection key. And it gets pretty complicated because we can have multiple MCP server instances for the different people at the company. So yeah, this is a little more on roughly what it looks like, what our implementation looks like. But so you can see it's all these basic primitives. And the nice thing is here that if you're curious about how our MCP server implementation, MCP client implementation works, it's all open source. So you can kind of go and search for some of these strings in our repo, and you can find them and ask questions. And we get customers like helping us make improvements that are usually serving them, but obviously everyone gets to benefit from them. Some technical bits that, again, are a little different from some of the MCP client implementations that you'll see. So we have lazy connections. So if we're aware of a tool, but we don't have an MCP server connected, we can keep the schema for that tool and the description for it. And under the hood, since we're wrapping the implementation of these tools, we will connect to the server as part of the tool call and fire off all these connection events to make sure the user is authorized. We can handle all the things you'd expect from a Slack bot, so text, images, audio, MCP resources. We've also got, so like I talked about, since we have multiple people, since we have multiple connections, and we have to find a way to map from, we say like one tool exists, but depending on which user calls it, we're going to do a slightly different thing under the hood. And I think I also wanted to note here that our LLM is not smarter. So we haven't got into fine tuning. It's something that we may do at some point, but and again, I hope I can show an example of this, that our LLM does dumb things just like everybody else's. It hallucinates, it gets things wrong. We haven't done enough prompt engineering to make sure it uses Notion linear exactly right every time. But this agent loop concept that I think has made tools like Codex, Claude Code, and OpenCode really successful is that it does something and then it has to kind of figure out, am I done here? Should I stop responding? Should I just say like, here you go, I've solved your problem? Or does it need to make another LLM request? And I think our tool, more than most others, you can see exactly that mechanism. You can see what it tries to do. You can and you can kind of trace where it's gone wrong, and the end results are much better, we find, because of that. Roughly, and this is just for anyone curious about Iterate, because it's because there's an open source SDK. So if you are using the Iterate bot, you'll have an iterate.config.ts in a GitHub repo that either we manage or you can manage, and you can use our SDK, which is open source, but also the entire thing is open source. So we have a concept called an operating system, which is basically our Cloudflare deployment, which has all of the brains of the whole bot. And because all of it is open source, if you want to, you can host it yourself. But if you're using our Iterate bot, we basically we try and keep it really, really simple, and we charge based on token usage. So it's a markup based on token costs. A key concept for us, and this links into MCP in a way I'll show later as well, is this iterate config, which is just TypeScript. So you can pull in anything you want. You can define your prompts the way you want. So none of our customers have said, yes, this is perfect, when we say, this is our bot as it's configured basically for our company and in a way that we think will be useful for startups from day one. But all of them always start kind of tweaking these prompts and taking them where they want. I can talk briefly about what matches are as well, but this is basically a way to say this is a rule. It's kind of like a cursor rule. It's basically saying if this condition is true, then you should behave like a pirate. So in this case, it would be always. So yeah, these MCP servers make our agent really extensible, and we can kind of do the part of making the brain of the agent work. So this is the part that may be even more rough around the edges. I'm going to try and we've recently introduced Slack Connect support. So I'm going to log into our staging deployment, which we have been deploying in a fun way today. And I'll show you kind of what it looks like if you are a founder starting up and want to log in. So bear with me here. I'm going to use one-time password login, and let's see if we can get in. So this email-based one-time password login is actually only enabled in staging, because what we really want to do is make sure that the bot can connect with tools. So obviously it's a lot more useful if you're signing in with Google or signing in with Slack, and then that Google account might be linked with Notion, might be linked with Linear, and might be linked with a lot of other tools. So it makes it much smoother to onboard to other tools. But obviously it's we're trying out just to test out our onboarding flow. So this is what you'll get to test out with us. So because we found a lot of customers don't have admin permissions to add the bot as like a fully fledged bot to our workspace and just want to try it out with a Slack Connect channel. Anyway, so I'm going to invite myself with a special suffix to a Slack Connect channel, and there we go. Let's see. And then this is where you'll have to bear with me a little bit. Let's see, did I get a new email inviting me? Yes, here we go. A new message. So I'm invited to work with myself on Slack. This is obviously not exactly what the experience would be like, because I'm having to switch between windows just to make it seem like I'm a new person. But so this is actually what it would look like if you've never even used Slack before. You can still get started with it. I'm going to get another email this time from Slack, since I'm now a new Slack user, according to them, because they've never seen this email address before. And this is the Slack web client. Again, most people are going to be using like a single Slack instance that they're not using for the first time and flooded with tips. So you can see this is the preview version of our bot that is already kind of thinking about whether it needs to reply to this Slack bot auto message. But basically I can say hi, and now we've got a bot. Yeah, so another thing that that it's worth mentioning is that we also have we're testing out MCP servers probably as much as anyone is. So we ended up writing again in the last couple of days. So bear with me if this doesn't work. We have a mock MCP server that is publicly available for people to use if they want to test out their own MCP client implementations. And this is quite a good way of saying, like, you can connect to an MCP server that our bot does not know about yet. So let's see. So this will basically use Slack features to say, let's authorize with our mock server, and let's see if our mock server is working. Okay. So this is a bug. I have to go through onboarding twice when I'm using email one-time password. I should already have a trial, so hopefully it just lets me complete onboarding again. Sorry about this. And I need to make sure I'm in the right bot. So let's see if I can get to it this time now that I've gone through onboarding. Yes. So I'm going to use an auto-generated user, but you could log in with any email address and password, and then it should take me back to Slack. Again, I'm using the Slack web client, but imagine I came back to Slack, and since I didn't get the deep link, I may have to say, are you connected? And let's see if the bot is smart enough to figure that out. Yes, so the bot is connected. What tools do you have? So you can see it actually even shows in the typing indicator. It can show a little bit about what some of the previews. So prep for demo beta. So I'm going to create a note to prep for demo beta, and then it should be able to call tools. And I think anybody watching this will have seen how MCP tools work. So I kind of want to switch back, and I can show you, since this is all a demo, you can imagine how this would look if this email address had a real Notion space and had a real linear connection. But I can show you an example of what it looks like when it's connected to basically a real company, because we want to make sure this is useful for founders, for startups. So this was an example I alluded to earlier. List my linear issues, and then it gave, here are my assigned issues in linear, and then I asked it to list the Notion pages I've written. And again, this was after I went through the similar connection flow to Notion. Here are the pages that I had authored. And then, like I was talking about earlier, I also want to know what Rahul's linear issues are, and not necessarily mine. And this is where it gets really, really useful when you're working in a team, and you can kind of find out if anybody is kind of stepping on each other's toes and working on conceptually similar stuff. So this allows us to list Rahul's linear issues. I also I want to show you a little bit about how this looks in our dashboard, because if for the more technical folks, and please interrupt me if I'm going long on time, but I'll just show you a quick preview of what this looks like. So basically, this is our agent debug view that will show me. This was the first question I asked. It's a bit uglier because we want to show all of the gory technical details. And you can see tool calls. So first it had to connect to the MCP server, and that happened under the hood from the Slack point of view, but we want to keep everything as visible as possible. There were some message edits. It's listing issues, and then it sent that message. And this is the kind of Slack markdown. We could probably do a better job formatting. Then listing the Notion pages I've written. This is, I think, a really good example of how our bot is not that smart, but the agent loop makes it very powerful. So first it authorizes with Notion, and then it starts having problems. It starts sending these kind of useless, it starts doing these useless MCP tool calls, which I'm sure everybody has seen many times. And it gets an error message. It's saying like invalid arguments for the Notion search, code too small, minimum 1. So the query needs to be something of note. And then it starts trying out different things, and it's kind of gradually teaching itself about stuff. So first it tried to use my Iterate user ID to search within Notion, and it got a problem saying that user didn't exist. So then it realizes it has to get the users in Notion. It then does another search, and eventually it actually finds the Notion page that I've written. So that was, I mean, so this is a kind of classic agent loop thing, but what we found is that combining it with multiplayer, and it's something that you can access on your phone, was something quite novel, and we found super useful. Yeah.
Misha, this is really cool. I know one of the things you were kind of going to hit on was sort of how multiple users kind of interact with this, and you deal with identity in there. I don't know if you've got a couple seconds to kind of hit on that, or demo, maybe not demo, but just at least explain, because that was super interesting to me from a conceptual level. But I didn't quite see how you did that.
Yeah, so it's so basically when we're wrapping these tools that come from the MCP servers, we inject and impersonate, depending if it's a personal mode connection, we will inject an additional property on the schema called impersonate user ID. And that basically tells our backend, okay, this is the user ID that should be making the search. In this case it was Notion get users that should make the request. In the case of Notion, I think their search doesn't have a list my pages API, which is why it tried to use my user ID for something else. But so maybe an easier example will be, you'll see it's a familiar format in linear, list issues. It's doing that same thing. It's injecting my impersonate user ID, so then we intercept that tool call because we've got this slightly modified version of the linear MCP list issues tool. And then we say, okay, we know what this user ID is. We have the MCP connection. We have this mapping from user ID to MCP connection. And then we will look up that MCP connection in the durable object, and then we'll invoke the tool call under the hood using the correct authorization headers, basically.
So this is fascinating because like from a technical perspective, like having worked in all these areas or whatever, like what you're doing is very impressive. It's very cool, technically under the hood and stuff. One question I had is when you're like, if you're in a Slack channel and you type, does that always go as the input to the agent? So like the agent is getting because that's one of the things with when you get into multi-user that's kind of weird, is like, does the agent observe the entire thread, or does it only respond when you say @agent? Or if you just, how are you handling, kind of that?
Yeah. So basically right now it is, we've kind of gone back and forth on this, and I don't think we're done with the kind of heuristic. And actually what we want to do is have the agent have at least some ability to decide when it wants to jump in or not. But basically the rule of thumb is, if it's a top level thread or a thread where the agent has not been mentioned, it's not going to respond unless you @ it. Once you're in a thread where it has been mentioned, it will basically respond to every message. It can, if the message is something like stop talking, or something else where it's clearly not needed anymore, it will kind of decide to shut up on that thread until it's mentioned it anymore. But what we're kind of moving towards is basically the agent deciding if it's useful to jump in or not, because there have been some cases where, you know, people will ask a question and nobody answers because they're not online. And then we've wanted for a few minutes later, the agent to say, like, since no one's answering this, I just looked up everything and cross-referenced all your Notion pages and linear issues, and I think this is the answer to your problem. And we've found it's able to do that if you at it, but if you don't think to at it, and we found a lot of our customers kind of, in some cases, I've got to be honest, they forget the bot exists because there's a lot of AI tools out there. So we're kind of going back and forth on that, but right now it needs to be triggered. You need to say at iterate for it to get involved.
In the response, I'm just kind of curious if, like, when the agent replies, you know, because you're sending the message to an agent has response. Is that response is what gets sent back to Slack, or does the agent have to call a tool to reply to?
Yeah. So right now it's you may be able to see this. So that's the it's actually a tool called Send Slack Message.
Yeah.
And this
cool.
is our most frequently used tool. And this is, we've chatted with folks at OpenAI who've said we're using the responses API rather than the chat API.
Yeah,
and they've said, like, this is kind of the direction things are going. And we're trying to, like, break that assumption that everything is like user assistant. We do use, so we use system prompts, of course, and then user messages, but even the user messages, they're kind of formatted based on Slack webhooks. So it kind of says, it tells you, it says you've received a webhook that looks like this. And then actually, and a nice thing, and again, all of this is open source. You can see when we have a core LLM request start event, that's one of our important events, you can actually just see the raw request, exactly what we send to OpenAI, which we found is being really useful. And we've kind of started to use tools like Brain Trust less and less, because you can see exactly what's sent here, and you can see the bot added reaction eyes from the Slack message, so it gets all of this context, and this is what a user message looks like to the bot. And we found it's
a fascinating pattern that I've seen, because it's cool that you're doing this, is like, because you kind of get trapped in this model with a chat bot where you have kind of like user assistant. So you think like I have to tell it something and it has to reply to me. But if you flip your paradigm, and it's kind of what you've done, which I think is beautiful. That's why, like, I really appreciate what you've done. Like, this is really good. Is if you flip the paradigm, thinking that no, the agent is an agent that is capable of doing things, and the input, just treat it more like an event. So you just tell the agent, this is what just happened. You decide what to do. So if you just say a user has typed this message, if it's applicable, then you should call the tool. Otherwise, do nothing. You know, so it's like it has the ability to choose, and so the response to that agent is from that agent to a certain degree. You know, to a certain degree, if you really optimize things, you could ignore the response, but the response of the agent would just be like, I have now sent that message to, you know, but you would probably prompt it and just say, like, don't really reply back with anything.
Yeah. Well, no, I mean,
it's useless. Yeah.
If you search for do nothing in our code base, you will find a tool called do nothing, which we found really helps to kind of break that assumption that is basically in the training of these LLMs, that says, like, you have to respond, you have to do something. And so if the something that they do is a tool called do nothing, then you know, we consider ourselves done. And
there's also this weird assumption, if you give LLMs tools, it gravitates towards thinking it needs to call a tool.
Yes.
So it's a brilliant hack of the
it definitely is a hack, and we're definitely thinking about, like, whether we can change this, or whether it would be useful to, because sometimes the bot replies when I don't think it would be appropriate.
Yeah, I mean, I love hacks. You know, at the end of the day, I just, you know, we want to provide some value and functionality to someone. Whatever works.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
This is great. I think I love I love what you've done. I mean, so many good patterns. This is what I like is to see these really complex things like tool scaling and identity and stuff like that, of like, as we get into it and we figure it out, it's like the pattern's not rocket science. It's often a lot of code to implement. You know, it's like, especially if you start doing identity with OAuth, it's like freaking madness.
Yeah.
But the pattern makes sense, where it's like, okay, I can easily reason about this. This makes sense. Dynamic tool discovery, all these things. So it's cool. Like I like when MCP started, I was very skeptical of, you know, people were expecting magic, and it's like, I don't know if magic will work, but it's working. Like it's pretty cool.
It is.
You do this.
Yeah, and there are a couple of things I wanted to briefly touch on. So first of all, a lot of this MCP stuff was implemented by Zach Davidoff. So follow him on Twitter if you're watching along and you're interested. And I also wanted to talk about just code mode as something that's coming. So I don't have much to say on it, but we're really, really excited about Cloudflare's dynamic worker loading. So basically generate some TypeScript and run the TypeScript. And we found our early experimentation, it does that. It can solve, like, a lot of MCP problems kind of disappear, and you can start working with those servers of MCP servers where they're just low-level operations. So I know a lot of the guidance has said, like, you have to have a very broad thing, like onboard a user as an MCP tool. We found that with code mode enabled, so basically generate TypeScript, you can actually just have almost open API endpoints wrapped as MCP servers, and it works.
Yeah, and the super cool thing about MCP is, because people will throw out issues with MCP and say, oh, it's bad because of X, Y, and Z. But what I've found is, it's like all issues in MCP can be solved with MCP.
Yeah.
So the code mode MCP is kind of very interesting, where it's like, well, it's way more efficient if I just generate some TypeScript. So it's like, okay, well, I just create a code mode MCP server that you then give it a series of MCP servers that has a little bit of code in there, and through sampling and whatnot and blah, 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 like you can make that work. So it's like, oh, well, I just needed to put, because like you can create a dynamic tool calling, tool calling MCP that you just give it a series of MCP. So it's like these patterns are emerging, and it's really cool. The code mode one is amazing. I'm a fan. Like I would not say I'm a fan. I was very negative towards it when it came out, but I've grown to appreciate it. So that's that's cool.
Yeah,
guys, we need to wrap up. This is great, Misha. I really appreciate you coming on today. Haley, likewise. Thank you, guys. This was an excellent set. Lots of great content, lots of really good examples. Misha, congrats on the company and the startup. And Haley, please keep doing the amazing research and sharing it with people. It's enormously valuable at this stage in an ecosystem. So, Darren, thank you as always for jumping in, and we'll see everyone next week.
Awesome.
Take care.
Thanks very much, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.